The evening was quiet, and the rain tapped gently on the windows of a small roadside bar. The air smelled of fried food and spilled beer, and the sound of laughter filled the room. A group of bikers sat at a large table near the center, their leather jackets shining under the dim lights. They laughed loudly, clinking bottles, and telling stories that made half the room turn to look. They were the kind of men who wanted everyone to know they were there. The door creaked open slowly, and for a moment, the cold night air slipped inside. An old man stepped in. He looked like any ordinary old fellow you might pass on the street and never notice twice. His jacket was simple, worn out at the sleeves, and he leaned heavily on a wooden cane. His face was lined with age, the kind of lines that told you he had lived a long life, maybe even a hard one. His silver hair peeked out from under a flat cap, damp from the rain. He moved slowly, one careful step at a time, as though every step needed thought. Some people at the bar turned to glance at him. A few gave polite nods, while others quickly went back to their drinks. The old man didn't draw much attention, not compared to the loud laughter of the bikers. Still, the bartender, a middle-aged man with a kind smile, noticed right away. He wiped his hands on a towel and gestured toward a stool in the corner, away from the rowdy group. The old man gave him a gentle smile, the kind that carried more warmth than words. He made his way slowly across the room, his cane tapping the wooden floor. It took him longer than most, but he didn't seem to mind. He reached the stool and settled onto it with a soft sigh of relief, as if just sitting down was a comfort. The bartender leaned forward and asked what he would like to drink. The old man requested nothing more than a glass of water. No whiskey, no beer, just water. That simple choice caught the attention of one of the bikers. He leaned over to his friends, smirking as he pointed at the old man. They whispered to each other, their grins growing wider. One of them said loudly enough for the whole bar to hear, "Look at Grandpa over there. He doesn't even know how to drink." The group burst out laughing, their voices echoing across the room. The old man didn't flinch. He simply lifted the glass of water the bartender had set in front of him and took a small sip. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the weight of age. He put the glass back down carefully, as though it were precious. His calmness seemed to annoy the bikers more. They wanted a reaction, something to feed their pride, but the old man gave them nothing. Another biker got up from the table and swaggered toward the bar. He was tall, with a thick beard and arms covered in tattoos. His boots made heavy thuds on the floor as he walked. He stopped beside the old man, leaned over, and bumped the stool with his knee. It was a rough push, enough to make the stool wobble and nearly send the old man falling. A few people in the bar gasped, but the old man steadied himself with his cane and didn't say a word. The biker picked up the old man's glass of water, held it high in the air, and shouted, "This is what Grandpa drinks, huh? Water. Let me show him how real men do it." He tipped the glass to his lips and pretended to drink before setting it back down, laughing with his friends. The old man looked at him, his eyes calm but sharp, like a man who had seen far worse than a bar full of loud bikers. He spoke softly, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the nearby chatter. "I'd appreciate it if you gave that back." The biker paused for a moment. He had expected anger, maybe a shout, but the old man's steady voice caught him off guard. He smirked again, covering his surprise with mockery, and said, "Or what, old man?" His friends cheered from their table, urging him on. The bartender, watching carefully, stepped forward. He raised his voice, telling the biker to cut it out and leave the man alone. But the biker only laughed and shrugged, pretending it was just a joke. Still, he didn't hand the glass back right away. He held it like a toy, waiting for the old man to lose his patience. But the old man didn't lose anything, not patience, not composure, not his dignity. He kept his steady gaze on the biker, saying nothing more. After a long moment of silence, The biker finally set the glass back on the bar, muttering under his breath as he walked back to his friends. The group laughed again, but their laughter felt thinner, less certain than before. The old man reached out, picked up the glass, and took another sip as though nothing had happened. His hands shook slightly, but his face remained calm. He didn't seem bothered, not by the mockery, not by the laughter. His silence was stronger than any words he could have spoken. The rest of the bar watched him closely now. Some were curious, some uneasy. People could sense there was more to this man than met the eye. His jacket, though simple, had small faded pins on the chest, pins that told quiet stories for anyone who knew how to read them. A star, a ribbon, a symbol of service. Most people didn't recognize them, but a few older patrons squinted, trying to place where they had seen them before. The bikers, however, weren't finished. They leaned across their table, whispering and grinning, plotting their next way to get under the old man's skin. They thought he was just another fragile senior, someone to mock for a laugh. They didn't know who he really was. And so, while the rain kept tapping on the windows and the bar's warm lights flickered over glasses and bottles, a quiet tension settled in. The old man, George, sat in his corner, sipping his water with quiet dignity, while the bikers grew restless, eager for more fun at his expense. What no one in that room knew yet was that this ordinary-looking 90-year-old carried a past so powerful that it could silence even the loudest room. By the time the night was over, the bikers would not only stop laughing but turn pale when they realized just who they had chosen to mock. The bikers sat back at their table, smirking and slapping each other on the back as if they had just done something clever. They thought it was funny to bother the old man, and they believed the night would go on with them being the center of attention. But the quiet way George had handled himself made some of the other people in the bar feel uncomfortable. The room wasn't laughing with the bikers anymore, only at them, though they didn't notice. George, however, seemed completely at ease. He sat with his glass of water in front of him, looking down as though lost in thought. His cane rested across his knees, and he occasionally tapped it lightly as if keeping time with a tune only he could hear. His silence made him stand out more than any shouting could have. One of the younger bikers, who had been leaning back in his chair with a cocky grin, stood up suddenly. He was broad-shouldered with a chain around his neck and a loud laugh that filled the room. "Hey, old-timer," he called out, his voice carrying across the bar, "you too scared to drink anything stronger? We could get you some milk, maybe warm it up for you before bed." His friends burst into laughter again, pounding their fists on the table. George turned his head slightly, his calm eyes meeting the young man's. He didn't answer, didn't show anger, didn't even frown. He simply looked at him, and then slowly turned back to his glass. That quiet refusal to engage seemed to make the laughter ring hollow, but the bikers, caught up in their own pride, didn't realize it yet. The young man wasn't satisfied. He strutted over, dragging a chair from another table, and dropped it heavily right beside George. He leaned in close, his leather jacket creaking as he moved, and grabbed the old man's cane. "What's this, huh? You can't even walk without this stick," he said, twirling it carelessly. The bartender immediately stepped forward, his voice stern this time. "That's enough. Put it back and leave him alone." But the biker only chuckled and held the cane higher. George looked at the cane for a moment, then looked at the biker with steady eyes. His voice was quiet, but everyone nearby heard it. "That cane's been with me a long time. I'd like it back, please." Something in the way he spoke made the biker hesitate. It wasn't the words, it was the tone. Calm, measured, and firm, like someone used to being obeyed. For a split second, the biker felt something he couldn't explain, almost like a younger man being told off by someone he shouldn't disrespect. He shook it off quickly, covering the moment with another laugh. "Sure, old man. Here you go," he said, dropping the cane loudly on the counter. The clatter made some of the other patrons wince, but George didn't flinch. He calmly reached over, picked it up, and set it back across his knees. He gave the biker a small nod, not of thanks but of acknowledgement, as if to say, "I see you, and I don't fear you." The biker leaned back in his chair, annoyed that the old man hadn't given him the reaction he wanted. His friends called out encouragement from their table, telling him to push more, to get the old man to break. "Come on, teach him a lesson," one shouted. Another added, "Yeah, show him what happens when you disrespect the crew." But George had not disrespected anyone. He had done nothing but sit quietly and ask for his things back. His stillness made their noise feel childish, though they didn't see it yet. The young biker grabbed a bottle from the bar, filled with strong beer, and slammed it down in front of George. "Here, drink this. If you don't, maybe you don't belong in here at all." His tone was half mocking, half challenging. The bar had grown quieter by now. People were watching closely. Some were uneasy, ready to step in, but they held back, curious about how this would unfold. George slowly turned his head, looked at the bottle, then back at the biker. His lips curved into the faintest smile, one that seemed to carry more wisdom than amusement. "Son," he said gently, "I've had drinks stronger than that in places you wouldn't survive 5 minutes." The biker blinked, not sure how to answer. His friend's laughter faltered for the first time. George didn't touch the bottle. He simply picked up his glass of water again, as though he had already said enough. The way he spoke, calm but filled with quiet certainty, unsettled the men who thought they controlled the room. The biker sat there for a long moment, not knowing whether to press further or back away. Finally, he pushed the chair back and returned to his table, trying to laugh it off. But the laugh didn't come out the same this time. It was strained, forced. His friends tried to build the mood back up, but the bar itself felt different now. The other patrons kept their eyes on George. Something about him was drawing their respect, even though he had done nothing but sit quietly and speak softly. The pins on his jacket caught the dim light, and one older man at the far end of the bar squinted hard, recognizing the shine of something that wasn't just decoration. The bikers didn't notice. They were too busy whispering, trying to come up with another way to shake the old man. They thought of him as an easy target, someone who couldn't fight back. What they didn't realize was that the battle wasn't about fists or bottles. It was about presence, about the weight of a life lived with honor. And George carried that weight without ever needing to raise his voice. The night stretched on, the rain still drumming softly outside, but the tension in the bar kept building. The bikers wanted to win the room back, to make themselves the center again. George simply wanted to finish his glass of water in peace. But the quiet power in his presence made every insult they threw at him bounce back harder than they expected. They didn't know it yet, but they were getting closer to a moment that would change the way they saw him forever. And the longer George stayed silent, the more their laughter began to feel out of place. The bikers sat back at their table, their loud voices trying to fill the room again. They laughed harder than before, but it was forced, like they were trying to convince themselves they were still in control of the evening. Some of the other patrons gave them annoyed glances, but no one dared to step in. It wasn't unusual for this group to make noise and cause trouble, but tonight felt different. Tonight there was an old man sitting quietly, and for some reason, his silence was heavier than their shouting. George remained in his corner, sipping his water slowly. His cane rested across his lap, and his fingers tapped it now and then, not out of nervousness but with a rhythm, almost like he was remembering an old song. His eyes moved across the room, calm and steady, not flinching even when the bikers shouted. It was as if he had seen far worse than this in his lifetime, and compared to that, their games were nothing. One of the bikers, feeling restless, slammed his hand on the table. "This old man thinks he's too good for us," he barked, his eyes narrowing. "Sits there like he owns the place. Another agreed, "Yeah, he hasn't said a word, but he's acting like he's not scared. Who does he think he is?" The bartender, wiping a glass behind the counter, spoke up again. "Leave him be. He hasn't done anything to you." His voice was firmer this time, but he knew he had to be careful. The bikers were regulars, and though he didn't like their behavior, he couldn't afford a full fight in his bar. The group ignored him. One of the men, the same one who had taken George's cane earlier, leaned forward and said, "Maybe we should teach him some respect. Show him how this place works." The others laughed, nodding, slapping the table. George quietly set his glass down. He didn't look angry. He didn't look afraid. Instead, he slowly reached into the pocket of his jacket. The entire bar seemed to hold its breath. Even the bikers paused, their eyes following his every movement. A few people at the bar stiffened, worried he might be pulling out something dangerous. But George moved carefully, deliberately, and when his hand came back into view, it held something small and old. He placed it gently on the counter, the way someone might place a piece of their life down for others to see. The dim lights reflected off it, and a soft gleam spread across the surface. It was a metal worn with age, but shining with pride. At first, the bikers didn't understand. They squinted, leaning forward, trying to make sense of what they were looking at. But then a whisper rose from the other end of the bar. A man in his 60s, sitting alone with a glass of beer, spoke in a hushed tone, almost as if he couldn't believe his eyes. That's the Medal of Honor." The room grew silent. The laughter stopped. Chairs creaked as people leaned closer, wanting to be sure. The bartender froze mid-wipe, his eyes wide. Everyone had heard of the Medal of Honor, but very few had ever seen one in real life. It wasn't something handed out lightly. It was the nation's highest award for bravery, given only to those who had gone far beyond the call of duty. The bikers' faces began to shift. The smirks faded. Their jaws tightened, and for the first time that night, they didn't know what to say. The man at the end of the bar spoke again, louder this time, his voice carrying a note of awe. "George Walker," he said, staring at the old man. "I remember that name. He was in the war. Led men when everyone else was gone. Saved an entire unit." His words seemed to unlock memories for a few of the older patrons. They nodded slowly, their eyes fixed on George with newfound respect. George didn't respond. He didn't boast or correct them. He simply let the medal rest on the counter, his fingers lightly brushing it as if it was just another part of him. His silence said more than words ever could. The bikers shifted uneasily in their seats. They had wanted to embarrass the old man, to make him look small. Instead, they were the ones shrinking in their chairs, realizing who they had been mocking. Their faces, once filled with arrogance, now looked pale, almost guilty. One of them tried to laugh it off. "So what? That was a long time ago. He's just an old man now." But his voice cracked slightly, betraying the doubt he felt. His friends didn't echo the laugh this time. They sat in silence, staring at the medal, staring at George. George slowly picked up his glass again and took a sip of water. He didn't need to explain himself. The medal spoke for him, telling a story of courage, sacrifice, and leadership. It was proof that this frail old man had once faced things far greater than a bar full of loud bikers. The bartender leaned closer, his voice soft with respect. "Sir, thank you. Thank you for everything you've done." His words broke the silence, and a murmur of agreement spread across the room. People nodded, some even clapped lightly, though it wasn't the kind of clapping meant for entertainment, it was the kind meant for honor. The bikers sat frozen, their earlier confidence gone. One of them finally stood, walking slowly toward the bar. His steps were heavy, not with swagger but with shame. He stopped a few feet from George and cleared his throat awkwardly. We, we didn't know. We were just fooling around. His voice was quieter than anyone had ever heard it. George looked up at him, his eyes steady, his face calm. You don't need to know a man's history to treat him with respect, he said gently. His words carried no anger, only wisdom. The biker nodded quickly, unable to meet his gaze for long. The metal still shone faintly under the bar's light. It was small, but its presence filled the entire room. Everyone there could feel it, the weight of what it meant, the weight of the man who wore it. For the rest of the night, the bikers didn't laugh as loudly. They didn't mock anyone else. They sat quieter, sneaking glances at the old man who had turned their pride into silence with nothing but calmness and truth. George remained as he was, sipping his water, his cane across his knees, the metal resting on the counter like a quiet reminder. He didn't seek attention. He didn't want applause. He just wanted peace. But the room around him had changed. No one saw him as just a frail old man anymore. They saw him for who he truly was. And though the rain outside kept falling, inside the bar it felt as though a storm had passed, a storm of arrogance, washed away by the steady strength of one man's dignity. The metal stayed on the counter, catching the dim light of the bar. Its presence seemed to fill the room more than the loud laughter of the bikers ever had. People whispered to each other, stealing glances at George, trying to understand the story behind the quiet man sitting in the corner. The older patron at the far end of the bar leaned forward again. His voice was steady but soft, carrying weight as he spoke. I remember reading about him, he said. George Walker. He fought in Europe, in Korea too. His unit was trapped once, completely surrounded. Everyone thought they wouldn't make it out. But he led them through enemy lines, carried wounded men on his back, went back again and again until no one was left behind. The man shook his head in awe. They said he refused to leave the battlefield until every soldier was safe. A hush spread through the room. Some of the younger patrons, who hadn't grown up hearing those stories, looked at George with wide eyes. The bikers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. None of them spoke. Their earlier bravado had drained away, replaced with something they weren't used to: feeling shame. George didn't interrupt. He didn't correct the man or add details. He simply sat quietly, as if those stories belonged to another lifetime. To him, they weren't tales for applause. They were memories, heavy ones, that he carried in silence. The bartender placed a fresh glass of water in front of him, though George hadn't asked. It's on the house, sir, he said respectfully. George gave him a small nod, lifting the glass slowly as if acknowledging the gesture. The room stayed quiet, every eye fixed on him. One of the bikers, the tall one with the beard who had mocked him earlier, finally cleared his throat. His voice was unsteady when he spoke. We didn't know who you were, he said. We were just joking. Didn't mean any harm. His words sounded weak, and even he seemed to know it. George turned his head slowly, his calm eyes resting on the man. Respect doesn't depend on who a man is, he replied softly. It's not about medals, or battles, or history. It's about treating others the way you'd want to be treated, even when you don't know their story. The biker lowered his head, unable to hold George's gaze. His friends sat in silence, staring at the table in front of them. The arrogance that had filled them earlier was gone. Now they looked like boys who had been scolded by a teacher, only this lesson carried more weight than any they'd ever had before. The older patron continued to speak, almost to himself but loud enough for all to hear. He was awarded the Medal of Honor for that mission. Not many people live to wear one. Fewer still carry themselves with the kind of dignity he does. His eyes softened as he looked at George. It's an honor just to share a room with you. Other people in the bar nodded. A young couple whispered to each other, their eyes full of admiration. A man in a work uniform raised his glass quietly in respect. Even those who hadn't known much about history understood now. They were in the presence of someone who had faced things they couldn't even imagine. George didn't bask in the attention. He didn't smile proudly or straighten his back to appear grander. He simply sat as he always had, calm and steady. To him, this wasn't about glory. It was about truth. He had lived his life quietly after the wars, never seeking the spotlight. Tonight wasn't about reminding people of who he had been, it was about reminding them of how to treat others, no matter who they were. The bikers sat frozen, pale and stiff. For once, they had no words, no clever jokes, no laughter. They looked at each other helplessly, as if silently asking what they had gotten themselves into. One of them ran his hand nervously over the table, his rings clicking against the wood. Another shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable under the weight of the silence. Finally, the youngest among them stood up. He was the one who had teased George about drinking milk earlier. His face was red, his shoulders slouched. He walked slowly to the bar, stopping a few feet from George. "Sir," he began, his voice cracking slightly, I'm sorry. We didn't know. We were wrong to treat you like that." His eyes dropped to the floor, too ashamed to meet George's gaze. George looked at him for a long moment before answering. His tone was gentle, not harsh. "It's easy to laugh at someone who seems weaker," he said. "It takes real strength to stand beside them, to respect them, even when no one else does. Remember that." The young biker nodded quickly, swallowing hard. He returned to his seat without another word. His friends didn't tease him for apologizing. They couldn't. They felt the same shame weighing on them too. The bartender leaned on the counter, his eyes on George. "You've taught us all something tonight," he said sincerely. "Not just about respect, but about humility." The bar stayed quiet for a long time. The usual noise of clinking glasses and loud laughter seemed out of place now. People spoke in softer tones, glancing at George with a kind of reverence. Even the bikers, once the loudest in the room, sat subdued, their voices no more than whispers. George eventually reached for the medal again. He picked it up carefully, almost tenderly, and slipped it back into his jacket pocket. He didn't display it for pride, it was never about that. He had shown it only to quiet the storm around him, to remind people that appearances can be deceiving. Now it was hidden again, close to his heart where it had always belonged. As the night went on, the tension slowly eased, but the memory of that moment stayed heavy in the air. The bikers didn't mock anyone else. They kept to themselves, stealing occasional glances at the old man in the corner. Their pale faces still carried the weight of realization they had tried to humiliate someone who had once risked everything for the very freedoms they now enjoyed so carelessly. George sipped the last of his water, his eyes distant, as though he were somewhere else entirely. Maybe he was remembering the faces of old friends, battles long past, or the silence of nights far away. Whatever it was, he carried it quietly, just as he had carried everything else in his life. And in that little roadside bar, filled with people who had walked in expecting nothing more than another ordinary night, a powerful lesson had unfolded. They had all been reminded that greatness often wears no crown, no loud voice, no flashy clothes. Sometimes it walks in slowly, leaning on a cane, asking only for a glass of water. By the time George set his empty glass down, the room no longer saw him as a frail 90-year-old man. They saw him as a symbol of dignity, sacrifice, and respect. Even the bikers, pale and humbled, couldn't deny it. The night was drawing to an end. The rain outside had slowed to a gentle drizzle, and the sound of droplets tapping the windows seemed softer than before. Inside the bar, the mood had changed completely. The loud laughter and mockery that had filled the room earlier had been replaced by quiet voices, the kind people use when they know they are in the presence of something greater than themselves. George sat calmly at his stool, his cane resting across his lap, his empty glass pushed slightly to the side. The medal was no longer on the counter. It had been slipped back into his jacket pocket, hidden from view, but the memory of its shine still lingered in the minds of everyone there. That one small object had turned the whole night upside down. The bikers sat at their table, shoulders slouched, eyes lowered. They no longer looked like the kings of the room. Their pale faces told the story of men who had been humbled, men who realized too late that they had mocked someone they should have respected from the very beginning. A few of them glanced toward George now and then, but when his calm eyes met theirs, they quickly looked away. They didn't know what else to do. The bartender, wiping the same glass for the 10th time, leaned forward with a warm smile. "Sir," he said softly, "thank you for coming in tonight. I think you've taught us all more than you realize." George gave him a small nod, his lips curving into a faint smile. "I only came in for a glass of water," he replied gently. His words carried a quiet humor, but also truth. He hadn't set out to teach anyone anything. He had only wanted a place to sit and rest. The lesson had come not from anything he forced, but simply from who he was. He reached for his cane and carefully pushed himself up from the stool. His movements were slow but steady, each one filled with quiet determination. The room watched in silence. Even the clinking of glasses had stopped. It was as if everyone there wanted to honor the moment without breaking it with noise. George placed a few bills on the counter. The bartender tried to wave them away. "It's on the house," he insisted. But George shook his head. "I always pay my way," he said simply, leaving the money where it was. The bartender didn't argue further. He only nodded with respect, knowing there was no point in refusing a man like George. As George turned toward the door, the bikers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Finally, the tall bearded one stood. His boots felt heavier now than when he had stomped across the floor earlier. He took a hesitant step forward, then another. "Sir," he said quietly, his deep voice softer than anyone had ever heard it, we were wrong. I'm sorry." The other bikers murmured their agreement, nodding awkwardly, their bravado gone. They weren't used to apologizing, especially not in public, but tonight was different. Tonight, they knew they had crossed a line that could never be erased. George stopped, his hand resting on the cane. He turned his head slightly toward them. His eyes, steady and calm, met theirs. "You've learned your lesson," he said gently. "Make sure you carry it with you." There was no anger in his voice, only wisdom. He didn't humiliate them further. He didn't need to. They had already been humbled by the truth of who he was. The tall biker nodded quickly, swallowing hard. He stepped back, giving George space to pass. His friends did the same, rising from their chairs and moving aside. For the first time that night, they weren't blocking the room with their presence, they were clearing the way for someone else. George walked slowly toward the door, his cane tapping softly on the wooden floor. Each step seemed to echo louder than the laughter from earlier, not in noise but in meaning. The people in the bar watched with respect, some standing as he passed, others bowing their heads slightly. The room felt united in a shared understanding, one they hadn't expected when the night began. As George reached the door, the bartender called out, his voice steady and full of gratitude. "Good night, sir. And thank you." George paused, his hand on the door handle. He looked back at the room one last time. His eyes scanned the faces, the bartender, the patrons, even the bikers, and he gave a small nod. It wasn't a grand gesture, just a quiet acknowledgement. Then he pushed the door open and stepped out into the night. The cool air wrapped around him, and the gentle rain kissed his cap. He pulled his jacket tighter, his medal resting quietly against his chest inside the pocket. To anyone passing by on the street, he looked like just another old man walking home with a cane. They wouldn't have known the truth. But the people inside that bar knew, and they would never forget. Back inside, silence lingered for a long moment. Then the bartender let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. That, he said softly, was a real man. The older patron at the far end raised his glass in agreement. A hero, he added, his eyes shining. The younger ones nodded, their faces full of respect. Even the bikers stayed quiet, their heads bowed. They knew they would carry the memory of that night with them for the rest of their lives. The tall biker finally spoke, his voice low but sincere. "We'll never make that mistake again," he said to his friends. They all nodded. They had come into the bar to show off, to laugh, to prove their strength. But they left with a lesson about true strength, the kind that doesn't need to shout, the kind that endures through silence, through honor, through a lifetime of sacrifice. The rain outside continued to fall, soft and steady, washing the streets clean. Inside the bar, the story of George Walker, the 90-year-old veteran, would be told again and again. People would remember the night when bikers tried to mock him and ended up pale with shame when they learned his true identity. But more than that, they would remember the lesson he left behind, that respect should never depend on appearances, that dignity is something you carry in your heart, and that true heroes never need to prove themselves. George walked down the quiet street, his cane tapping against the wet pavement. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew the impact of his presence would remain long after he was gone. To him, it was just another night, another glass of water. But to everyone in that bar, it was a story they would tell for years, a story that would remind them of the power of humility, courage, and quiet honor. And so, the old veteran disappeared into the rain, leaving behind not just silence, but respect, the kind of respect that can never be demanded, only earned.